The sun was bright that afternoon, spreading its warmth across the quiet streets of the small town. People moved about, some returning from work, others shopping, and a few children riding their bicycles on the sidewalks. Among the crowd was a woman dressed in plain clothes. She wore a simple black jacket and jeans, her hair neatly tied back, and her steps calm and steady. She looked like anyone else, but there was a certain confidence in her walk, the kind that made some people glance twice before moving on. She carried herself with quiet strength, as though she was not easily shaken by the world around her. She walked past the grocery store and stopped near a small cafe, watching people with a faint smile. She loved observing life, the way strangers interacted, the way stories unfolded in every corner of the street. What no one around her knew was that she was not just an ordinary woman passing time. She was someone who carried a secret role, one that would soon surprise everyone in that town. A loud sound broke the peace of the moment as a patrol car pulled up to the curb. The flashing lights weren't on, but the way it stopped right beside her made a few people nearby pause. From the driver's side, a tall police officer stepped out. His uniform was neatly pressed, his badge shining, but his face held a stern expression that immediately made the air heavy. He was known by many in the town as a man who did his job with too much aggression. People whispered about him, saying he had a short fuse, that he often treated people unfairly, especially those he assumed did not belong. Yet, no one had ever openly challenged him. The officer's eyes scanned the woman quickly, and without hesitation, he walked toward her. His voice was sharp when he spoke, carrying across the street so others could hear. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone not one of curiosity but of suspicion. The woman turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes with calmness. She didn't answer right away, and that silence seemed to annoy him. The crowd had started to notice, and a few passers-by slowed down to see what was going on. "I asked you a question," the officer said again, louder this time. The woman finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. She told him she was simply walking, enjoying her afternoon, and that she had every right to be there. Her tone was polite, but there was no fear in her words. That calmness seemed to irritate the officer even more. He placed his hands on his belt and leaned slightly forward, as though trying to show authority through posture. The woman stood her ground. She didn't raise her voice or step back. She only repeated that she was walking and doing nothing wrong. The officer, instead of accepting that, began to ask for identification. His tone suggested he expected full obedience, no questions asked. The woman tilted her head slightly and asked him why he had stopped her in the first place. Her voice carried no anger, only a clear expectation of fairness. But fairness was not something the officer often practiced. A few people across the street had already taken out their phones, sensing the tension. The air seemed to tighten, like the moment before a storm. The officer's face hardened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not in front of an audience. His words grew harsher, and his stance more aggressive. The woman, however, remained calm. She didn't move away or lower her eyes. Her steady presence made it clear she would not be intimidated. That quiet resistance was powerful, but to the officer, it felt like defiance. The children on bicycles had stopped nearby, their eyes wide. A man carrying shopping bags stood frozen, unsure if he should step in. A couple sitting outside the cafe whispered to each other nervously. The town was used to seeing this officer act tough, but rarely had they seen someone remain so composed under his pressure. It was as if the woman knew something they did not, as if she had an invisible shield protecting her. The officer stepped closer, his voice rising, demanding once again that she show identification immediately. The woman replied softly that she would comply if he explained the reason for the stop. Her words were clear, logical, and respectful, but they were also strong. They carried the weight of someone who knew the rules and would not allow them to be bent without question. That strength, though quiet, unsettled him. Minutes seemed to stretch into long moments as more onlookers gathered. Some shook their heads, others whispered about calling someone higher in command. The officer, though, seemed to block out the voices around him. His focus was entirely on the woman who stood before him, unwavering. His breathing grew heavier, his frustration clearer, as though he felt his authority slipping away with each second she didn't bow down. The woman's calmness had become the center of the moment. Her silence between words spoke louder than any protest could. She was not there to fight, not there to argue, but she also would not allow herself to be bullied. The officer, blind to the truth of who she really was, mistook that calmness for arrogance. In his mind, he believed he had to show power, to remind her and everyone else watching who held control. But what he didn't realize was that this day, this choice, would change everything for him and for the town. The street grew quieter. Even the wind seemed to pause. The people waiting sensed that the moment was building toward something important. The woman took a slow breath, still standing tall, still unshaken, her eyes never leaving the officer's face. Her presence was steady like a rock in rushing water. Around her, the town held its breath, waiting for the next move, not knowing that behind her plain clothes and simple appearance was a truth that would soon turn this entire scene upside down. The officer's eyes narrowed as the silence stretched between them. The woman's calm refusal to be shaken made him feel as if his control was slipping, and that thought only fueled his anger. He had been in many confrontations before, but usually people gave in quickly. They lowered their voices, looked away, or nervously did as he demanded. But this woman was different. She did not step back, she did not tremble, and she did not show fear. Her steady gaze seemed to challenge his entire sense of authority, even though she had not raised her voice once. The crowd was growing. People who had been passing by stopped to see what was happening. Some held their phones up, recording every moment. A few whispered quietly, their words lost in the tension that filled the air. The officer, aware that people were watching, felt even more pressure. He wanted to show that he was in charge. To him, it was no longer about a simple request for identification. It had turned into a battle of pride, and he refused to lose in front of an audience. His voice grew louder. He repeated his demand for identification, his words sharp like arrows. The woman, however, stood as she had before. Her tone was even, her words calm. She asked once again for him to explain the reason for stopping her. Her question was simple, but it cut through his anger. It reminded him that she was right. According to the rules he had sworn to follow, he should have had a reason before stopping her. But instead of listening, he allowed his pride to take over. Every second that passed felt longer than the last. The officer's jaw tightened. His hand twitched as it rested on his belt, and his breathing grew louder. The woman noticed every detail, but she remained steady. Her stillness seemed to unsettle him more than if she had shouted back. It was as though she held some invisible strength, something greater than the power of his uniform. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "Why is he bothering her?" one voice whispered. "She hasn't done anything," said another. A few people urged the officer to calm down, but he ignored them. His focus remained locked on the woman, and in his mind, he saw her calmness as open defiance. Finally, his patience snapped. Without warning, he stepped forward, his voice booming as he accused her of resisting his orders. The woman tried to explain once more, but he cut her off with an angry shout. His words no longer sounded like questions. They sounded like threats. The moment grew heavy, and the onlookers sensed what might happen next. Some gasped, some shouted for him to stop, and some simply froze, unable to believe what they were seeing. And then, in a sudden burst of anger, the officer's hand rose and struck the woman across her face. The sound echoed sharply in the silence of the street. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The children on their bicycles stared in shock, their mouths open. The man with the shopping bags dropped one to the ground. The people with phones recording gasped loudly, their cameras shaking in disbelief. The woman staggered slightly but did not fall. She placed a hand on her cheek where the blow had landed, and then slowly lifted her head again. Her eyes met the officer's, but instead of fear or weakness, there was only calm authority. She did not shout, she did not cry, she did not argue. She simply looked at him, and in that moment, it felt as though the power between them had shifted completely. The officer, breathing heavily, expected her to step back, to bow down, to admit defeat. But she did none of those things. Instead, her silence filled the space, and the crowd's reaction began to turn against him. "Did you see that?" someone shouted. "He hit her for no reason," another cried. "This is wrong," voices rose from the group, anger and disbelief mixing together. The officer glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes and cameras fixed on him. He had acted without thought, blinded by his own pride, and now the world was watching. But instead of admitting his mistake, he straightened his shoulders as if to pretend nothing was wrong. The woman, however, remained still. Slowly, she lowered her hand from her cheek and took a step forward. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with a strength that no one could ignore. The crowd leaned closer, sensing that something important was about to happen. In that tense silence, the officer tried to speak again, his words stumbling as he repeated his demand. But this time, his voice no longer carried the same weight. The authority he thought he had was crumbling, and everyone could see it. The crowd was no longer silent. They shouted at him, accusing him, demanding answers. His face flushed red, not just from anger but from the realization that the situation was slipping out of his hands. The woman's silence, once mistaken for weakness, had become her greatest strength. She had not needed to raise her hand or her voice. She had shown the entire crowd that true power was not in shouting or striking, but in standing firm with dignity. The officer, however, could not see it. In his eyes, the moment was still a battle of control, and he was losing. He clenched his fists, his voice shaking as he tried to regain his authority. But the crowd no longer believed him. They had seen enough. They had witnessed his aggression, his pride, and his failure. The woman remained in front of him, tall and unshaken. She had not lifted a finger to fight back, but she had already won the respect of the people watching. They whispered about her strength, about how she had stood against him without fear. And though none of them knew yet who she really was, they sensed there was something different about her, something greater than they could understand in that moment. The officer, still blinded by his own anger, had no idea that the person he had just struck was not just another woman walking the streets. She was someone who carried a badge of her own, one with more power than his. She was someone whose true identity, when revealed, would shake the very ground he stood on. The street buzzed with restless energy. Some shouted, some filmed, some whispered, and some simply stared in silence. The officer's mistake was plain to everyone except himself. He believed he had shown power, but in truth, he had revealed weakness. The woman's quiet strength had made his aggression look small. And though the world did not yet know the truth of who she was, that truth was about to unfold, and when it did, it would change everything for the officer, for the town, and for the people who had witnessed this moment of injustice. The crowd's voices rose again, echoing through the street, while the woman's eyes never left the officer's face. Her silence spoke louder than any words could. She knew the time to reveal herself was near, but for now, she let him believe he still had control. The lesson he was about to learn would not only humble him but also remind the entire community of what real leadership looked like. The street was filled with whispers, gasps, and raised voices. The crowd that had gathered could not believe what they had just witnessed. A police officer had struck a woman who had done nothing but calmly stand her ground. People recorded from different angles, their phones held high, making sure every second was captured. Children looked frightened, and parents pulled them closer. Yet, through all the noise and shock, the woman who had been hit stood tall and steady, as though she carried a strength no one else could see. The officer, breathing heavily, tried to act as if nothing unusual had happened. He adjusted his belt, looked around, and barked out orders in an attempt to regain control. "Move along! This is official police business," he shouted, hoping his voice would silence the crowd. But no one moved. Instead, the voices grew louder. Some shouted at him for his behavior, others asked the woman if she was all right. People were no longer afraid. They had seen enough, and they wanted answers. The woman raised her hand gently, asking the crowd to calm down. Her gesture was small, but it carried power. The people grew quiet, curious about what she would do next. She took a slow breath, then stepped forward toward the officer. He stiffened, his face showing both anger and confusion. He had expected fear, maybe even tears, but not this calm determination. She looked him in the eyes, her voice clear and steady when she finally spoke. "You wanted my identification," she said. Her words were not loud, but everyone heard them. The crowd leaned in, waiting. She reached into her jacket pocket with controlled movements, not rushed, not hesitant. Every eye followed her hand as it slipped inside and pulled out a small black wallet. She opened it carefully and held it up for everyone to see. The golden badge inside gleamed under the sunlight. Gasps filled the air as people realized what they were looking at. It was not an ordinary badge. It was not the badge of a simple officer. It was the badge of the chief of police. The officer's eyes widened, his face draining of color. He blinked rapidly, as though trying to convince himself he was not seeing what was right in front of him. The woman closed the badge wallet slowly, her hand steady, and then she spoke again. "I am the new chief of police," she said, her voice calm but full of authority. The crowd erupted in shock. Some clapped, some shouted in support, and others simply stared in disbelief. The officer stumbled back a step, his mouth opening and closing but no words coming out. Every second felt heavy with meaning. The officer had thought he was in control, but now he was the one standing exposed. His actions, his anger, his aggression, all of it had been directed at the very person who had the highest authority in the department. The phones kept recording, capturing every flicker of his panic and every ounce of her strength. The woman did not shout, did not gloat, did not use harsh words. She simply stood there, her presence commanding respect without needing to demand it. She looked around at the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one, letting them know that she saw them, that she heard their voices, and that she stood with them. The people responded with cheers, their energy rising as though justice had finally spoken. The officer tried to speak, his voice trembling. I didn't know," he stammered. But his words sounded empty, and no one was willing to defend him. The woman turned her eyes back to him, calm but firm. "You didn't need to know who I was," she replied. "Every person deserves respect. Every person deserves fairness. That is what you swore to uphold." Her words cut deeper than any punishment could. The crowd clapped and cheered again. The officer's hands shook as he tried to explain himself, but the noise of the people drowned him out. His authority had vanished. His uniform no longer looked like a symbol of order. It looked like a mask that had just been ripped away. The woman raised her hand once more, and the crowd slowly settled down. She looked at the people, then back at the officer. "This is not about me," she said. "This is about the way every citizen is treated. No one should face fear or harm simply for walking down the street." Her voice carried over the heads of the crowd, reaching every corner of the street. It was a promise, spoken not as a politician but as a leader who truly understood what justice meant. Reporters had arrived by now, their cameras pointed, their microphones ready. The news spread quickly, faster than anyone could have imagined. The people of the town, who had often felt unseen, were suddenly witnessing history. The woman's reveal was not just about her badge. It was about a shift in power, about a message that things would no longer be the same. The officer, pale and shaken, could no longer hide his fear. He looked at the cameras, then at the woman, and finally at the crowd that now shouted for accountability. He had lost everything in that moment: his pride, his respect, his false sense of control. He realized that his actions had not only exposed him but had also opened the door for the truth to come out. The woman stood tall, her expression steady. She did not need to punish him with anger, the truth itself was punishment enough. The people had seen who he really was, and they had seen who she truly was. The difference between them was as clear as daylight. The crowd began chanting her name, calling her chief, their voices united in support. For many of them, it was the first time they felt real hope that someone in authority understood their struggles. For the children watching, it was a moment they would never forget: the day they saw dignity triumph over cruelty. The woman nodded to the people, acknowledging their support, but she did not let the moment turn into a celebration. Her eyes remained serious as she looked once more at the officer. "There will be consequences for your actions," she said firmly. "Not just because of who I am, but because of what you have done." The officer lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. The air around them felt lighter now, as though the weight of silence had been lifted. The people felt a sense of justice, not complete but beginning. They knew this was not the end of the story, it was the start of something bigger. The woman's reveal was more than just an identity exposed. It was a symbol of change, a turning point that the entire town had needed for a long time. The officer stood frozen, his career crumbling before his eyes, while the woman stood in quiet strength, her leadership shining through without the need for force. The crowd cheered again, their voices blending into one powerful sound. And in that moment, everyone knew that the town would never forget the day a woman in plain clothes revealed herself to be the chief of police and taught a lesson that would echo for years to come. The news of what had happened spread faster than anyone expected. By the evening of that very day, the story was already all over social media. Clips of the officer striking the woman were shared thousands of times, each video showing the shocking moment, followed by the powerful reveal of the woman holding up her badge as the new chief of police. People from different towns and even other states commented, some outraged, others inspired by her calm strength. The small town that had once been quiet was now at the center of attention. Inside the police department, the atmosphere was heavy. Officers whispered among themselves, unable to believe what had happened. Some had long suspected that their colleague had problems with his temper, but they never thought it would go this far. Now his actions had not only embarrassed the department but had placed it under the spotlight of national attention. The chief arrived at the station later that day, no longer in plain clothes but in full uniform. Her badge was pinned proudly to her chest, her posture strong, her face calm. As she walked through the halls, officers turned their heads, some out of respect, some out of guilt, and some out of fear of what her leadership would bring. She greeted them politely but firmly, making it clear she was not here to play favorites or ignore problems. She was here to lead with fairness and justice. The officer who had struck her was sitting in a small room, his hands shaking, his face pale. He had been removed from duty immediately after the incident. His badge and weapon had been taken, and he now sat waiting for what would come next. He replayed the moment in his head again and again, wishing he could undo it, but knowing it was far too late. The chief entered the room, her presence filling the space. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Her voice was calm, not loud, but it carried weight. She told him that his actions had not only disrespected her as a person but had betrayed the oath he took as an officer. He lowered his head, unable to respond. She made it clear that accountability was coming, not just for him but for anyone in the department who believed power was meant to intimidate rather than serve. The department issued a public statement that evening, confirming the suspension of the officer and promising a full investigation. But the people of the town were not satisfied with words alone. They gathered outside the station, demanding real change. For years, many residents had felt ignored or mistreated. Now that their new chief had shown both courage and calm strength, they were ready to stand with her. The chief stepped outside to address them. The crowd cheered when they saw her, their voices calling her name. She raised her hand, and the noise slowly quieted. She spoke with honesty, telling them she had seen with her own eyes what they had been saying for years. She promised them that things would not go back to the way they were. She spoke of fairness, of justice, of a police force that worked with the community rather than against it. Her words struck deeply, not because they were loud, but because they were sincere. Over the next few days, the department faced more scrutiny than ever before. Reporters crowded the town, asking questions, filming segments, and pressing for details. The chief did not hide. She faced the cameras, answered questions directly, and admitted that change was overdue. She explained that her undercover walk through the neighborhood was intentional. She wanted to see for herself how people were treated when they did not wear a uniform. She had not expected the test to come so quickly, but now it had revealed exactly what needed fixing. The officer who struck her faced immediate disciplinary hearings. Witnesses came forward with stories of his past behavior, moments when he had spoken harshly, when he had used his position to intimidate rather than protect. For years, people had whispered but felt powerless to act. Now their voices were heard. Each story added weight to the case against him, and each one reminded the town why reform was so important. Other officers, too, felt the shift. Some were nervous, worried that their own past actions might come under review. Others felt relief, knowing that fairness would now be valued over favoritism. The chief encouraged them to see this as a new beginning. She told them that the badge was not a symbol of power over people, but of responsibility to people. Those who could not accept that truth would have no place in her department. Meetings were held with community leaders, local business owners, and residents. The chief listened more than she spoke, letting people share their fears and their hopes. She promised not only to hear them but to act on what she learned. Programs for training in bias, respect, and community service were announced. Plans for greater transparency were set in motion, including open meetings where residents could speak directly with officers. For the first time in a long while, people felt they had a voice. The officer who had caused all this stood before an internal review board, his career hanging by a thread. He tried to defend himself, claiming he had been under pressure, that he had not recognized who she was. But the chief's earlier words echoed in the room: respect was not about rank, it was about humanity. His excuses fell flat, and it was clear to everyone that he had failed in his duty. The story became larger than the town itself. News channels across the country ran reports about the new chief who had exposed misconduct by living the experience herself. Some called her brave, others called her wise, but all agreed that her leadership was different. She had shown that change was not just possible but necessary. Within the department, trust began to shift. Officers who had felt silenced started to speak up, sharing ideas on how to serve better. Younger recruits looked to the chief as a role model, inspired by her strength and calmness. Slowly, the culture began to change. It was not easy, and there was resistance, but the momentum was on her side. As for the officer who had struck her, his days in uniform were numbered. He faced disciplinary action, legal consequences, and the weight of public shame. The very crowd that once stayed quiet under his authority now demanded his accountability. His fall was swift, and it served as a warning to anyone who thought the badge gave them power without responsibility. The chief continued her work, not with arrogance but with quiet determination. She knew this was only the beginning. The road to rebuilding trust was long, but she was ready for it. Every meeting, every reform, every conversation was a step forward. The incident that had started as an act of aggression was now becoming the foundation of transformation. The town began to see change not just in the department but in its spirit. People felt safer speaking up, knowing someone would listen. Children who had once been told to stay silent now saw a leader who valued their voices. And though the memory of that day would never be erased, it became a reminder of how quickly wrong can be turned into right when truth and dignity take a stand. The consequences of that single moment had spread far and wide. One officer's mistake had revealed the flaws of the system, but one woman's strength had revealed the path forward. And now, under her leadership, the town was slowly learning that respect, fairness, and justice were not just words, they were promises that could be lived every day. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the small town had experienced before. Change was no longer just a word whispered in frustration, it had become something real. The image of the new chief standing tall in front of the crowd with her badge still burned in the memory of everyone who had seen it. Children talked about her at school, neighbors discussed her bravery over dinner, and elders in the community said they finally felt hope again. For the first time in years, the people believed that fairness could exist in the very system that had often left them silent. The police department, once filled with fear and hesitation, began to move in a new direction. Officers who had served for decades found themselves sitting in classrooms once more, learning about fairness, respect, and how to treat every person with dignity. It was not easy for everyone. Some resisted quietly, thinking the old ways had worked well enough, but the chief made it clear that the old ways had no place under her leadership. She reminded them daily that the badge was not a shield to misuse but a symbol of responsibility to protect. Community meetings were held every week. The chief sat among the people, not on a stage above them but on the same level, face to face. She listened to their stories, some painful, some hopeful, all honest. A mother spoke about how her son had once been stopped for no reason and how she had lived in fear since. A young man explained how he never trusted the police until the day he saw her reveal her badge in front of the angry officer. An elder explained that for years, they had avoided calling for help even when needed, because they felt they would not be treated with respect. The chief listened to each of them with patience, writing notes, nodding, and promising to act. Soon, the department began new programs. Officers walked through neighborhoods not with suspicion but with open hands, greeting shopkeepers, helping children cross busy streets, and showing presence without intimidation. The town slowly began to see them not as enemies but as protectors again. Trust did not return overnight, but with each small action, it started to grow. The disgraced officer who had struck the chief faced his final hearings. Cameras filled the room as the decision was read. He was officially removed from the force, his badge taken away forever. Some people felt pity for him, but most agreed that it was the right choice. His career ended the same way it had been lived, through arrogance and carelessness. He walked out of the department quietly, no longer a symbol of power but a lesson of what happens when pride replaces duty. The chief did not celebrate his downfall. Instead, she used the moment to remind everyone that accountability was not about revenge but about learning and growing. She told the department that mistakes would be dealt with, but they would also be used as lessons for the future. Her words carried weight because they came not from anger but from wisdom. She had experienced injustice herself and turned it into a path for change. National reporters continued to cover the story. The chief gave interviews, not to seek fame but to share the message that every community deserved fairness. She became a symbol beyond her town, a reminder that leadership is not about rank but about integrity. Other cities called her for advice, asking how she managed to turn a moment of aggression into a movement for reform. She always gave the same answer: by listening, by standing strong, and by never forgetting that respect is the foundation of justice. Within the town, people noticed changes in their daily lives. Children played freely again without their parents watching nervously. Shop owners greeted officers without fear. Residents who had once avoided speaking out now felt comfortable attending meetings and voicing concerns. The town, once divided by mistrust, was slowly stitching itself together. One afternoon, a group of children rode their bicycles past the police station, laughing and ringing their bells. The chief watched from the steps of the building, a smile spreading across her face. She remembered the day those same children had frozen in fear when the officer had struck her. Now they rode freely, unafraid, living the kind of childhood they deserved. It reminded her that real change was not seen in big speeches but in the small freedoms people felt in their everyday lives. The chief continued to walk the streets, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in plain clothes. Wherever she went, people greeted her warmly. Some called her chief, others simply smiled, but all looked at her with respect. She never grew arrogant. She reminded herself daily that leadership was not about being admired but about serving those who placed their trust in you. Months passed, and the town had changed. It was not perfect, no place ever is, but it was different. There was a new spirit in the air, one of accountability, fairness, and hope. The chief had shown that true authority does not come from fear or force but from honesty, respect, and dignity. The day finally came when the community held a public gathering to thank her. Families filled the park, children held signs, and music played in the background. When she took the stage, the cheers echoed across the field. She raised her hand for silence and spoke from the heart. She told them that the journey was not hers alone but theirs together. She reminded them that change would only last if they worked side by side, holding each other accountable and lifting each other up. The crowd erupted in applause, not just for her words but for what she had done. The woman who had once been struck on a street corner now stood before them as a leader who had transformed their town. Her story became more than a headline, it became a lesson that spread far beyond their borders. In the end, the true victory was not the punishment of one officer but the transformation of an entire community. The town had learned that silence allows injustice to grow, but courage, even quiet courage, can stop it. The woman who had been underestimated, who had been mistaken for someone without power, had shown everyone that dignity is stronger than pride and truth stronger than violence. The streets that had once echoed with tension now echoed with laughter, conversation, and trust. The people walked freely, and the officers served with integrity. And at the center of it all stood the chief, not as a hero seeking glory, but as a servant leader, guiding with wisdom and strength. Her story remained a reminder that real power is not in the hand that strikes but in the heart that stands firm, even in the face of injustice. And in that small town, under her leadership, respect, fairness, and hope became not just promises but everyday reality.